Hello and thank you for watching. I wanted to share with you my thoughts about the Asia-Scotland Institute and what we plan to do in the coming months in the face of this quite extraordinary pandemic and crisis that we all face. But first, let me thank those of you who have been supporting us as partners and sponsors and members over the past years, and look forward to those who will come with us on the journey as we put our programs together going forward. What we've been doing is bringing global leaders to Scotland, global leaders and thinkers to share with you their thoughts and ideas on the key issues in Asia. This clearly will be impossible going forward. And so through the use of technology, through podcasts, through webinars, and through recorded messages from people around the world, we'll be bringing you virtually, if you like, information on key issues and markets. This involves focusing on certain specific areas, and your thoughts on this will be hugely helpful as well. The first is obviously COVID-19, the impact that it's having in different countries and where best practice is being pursued by countries, of which we will hear through country experts in the coming months.
Your thoughts on where we are and what life's going to be like when this all ends?
Well, I've given quite a lot of thought to it, although I can't say I've got any clear or definitive answers, because everything is just so mysterious, uncertain. I mean, I can't recall in a sort of economic or financial sense a situation anything like this in my lifetime. I mean, certainly the uncertainty is I mean, you think about the sorts of things you would need to create additional certainty at this stage. You'd ideally want to have a vaccine. You'd ideally want to have successful application of antiviral drugs. You'd ideally want to feel confident that the virus itself was perhaps mutating in a way that made it more benign, which is eventually, I think, what happened with Spanish flu back in the period from 1918 to 1920. You'd also like to know whether all countries can actually do the same kind of lockdowns and social distancing, or whether actually for some countries this is incredibly difficult. With my economic hat on, I think the reality is that for some countries, those in Europe, maybe North America, we can just about cope with this process, and it's it's difficult. But for other parts of the world, particularly in emerging markets where the housing stock is generally quality, where people are often living right next door to each other in terrible conditions, where the financial pockets are not deep at all, you just can't do social distancing, and even if you wanted to, you probably couldn't afford to do it. So I really fear for some countries around the world that although the numbers for those countries as yet are nothing like as bad as what we've seen in, for example, Europe or indeed the US, I fear that these countries may have some terrible things coming their way with you. And I mean, I was discussing with someone just the other day about India and the fact that Modi has imposed this lockdown on India, and you think, well, that's fine because that's what everyone else is doing. But when you realize that India hasn't got the same kind of social security system or tax system that we take for granted in the West, when you realize that that makes it incredibly difficult to distribute funds to those who are in need, you've got a significant danger of people simply being unable to purchase food and to actually cope with the real basics of life. And I was talking to an Indian friend of mine who lives in the UK, who's got family in India. And he was saying that they really fear the possibility of a famine there. And I don't think that's unrealistic, sadly. So those things, I think, are all hugely difficult at this stage. So uncertainties are huge, and uncertainties in terms of what you can do about the virus are huge for the time being. And then you think, well, what is the economic response? Well, first of all, this is different from the Great Depression, although the numbers we're likely to see in terms of GDP, I think, are going to be very similar to the Great Depression, frankly, if not worse. It's different because, of course, the Great Depression was partly a financial and banking crisis that had huge consequences for the real economy. In this current situation, the real economy is in trouble because of the lockdowns, the social distancing and so on. But that in turn could lead to some kind of financial upheaval. You've only got to look at the downgrades that happened from the ratings agencies for a whole bunch of companies already. That has huge implications investors do.
Yeah.
And you also have to look at the numbers that have been coming out over the course of the last few weeks. Now, with my chat on, knew already that this was going to be bad news, because we knew that in February, China, really didn't hit a brick wall, hit a brick wall with rubber in it that forced it to kind of go back in the opposite direction, just fell. China's been growing at, even recently when it hasn't been quite so strong, it's been growing at 6 or 7% a year in real terms. My colleagues at HSBC think that maybe in the first quarter of this year, the economy contracted maybe 5-6%. So that's a fast-growing economy now suddenly contracting at 5 or 6% over the year, which is itself pretty extraordinary. I remember talking also to my Chinese colleagues about that have come through subsequently. Everyone gets excited about the fact that Wuhan has sort of begun to unlock itself, the Hubei province is being reintroduced or reintegrated back into the Chinese economy. But levels of activity in many areas are still only 60-70% of what they were before the virus struck. So you're still talking about levels of activity in construction and so on, which are far weaker than they had been previously. And moreover, although there was lots of talk earlier this year about China going through a sort of V-shaped story, things would collapse and rebound incredibly quickly, China now has a problem that even if domestically China picks up, it's the rest of the world that's now holding China back. So, about 20% of Chinese GDP is exported to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is not doing very much in the way of buying. So that's an enormous headwind for China, irrespective of what happens within the Chinese economy itself. And as far as the West is concerned, we recognized pretty quickly that Italy economically would be in terrible difficulty in the short run, but that of course now applies to Spain, to France, to Germany, to Austria, to, well, you name it. They're all in trouble, as indeed is the UK. And of course, the US now is also in huge trouble. And these jobless claims, these initial jobless claims that are published every single week, it's not often to see something which is genuinely off the charts, but that's exactly what we're now seeing. Absolutely. So as of this lunchtime, UK time, there's been almost 7 million people in the US that have lost their jobs in just the last 3 weeks. 17 million. Again, I've never seen anything like this. This is much faster in terms of the shakeout that we saw during the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression itself, it varied across countries. The US had a particularly bad experience, GDP down 25-30% in real terms. The UK better because we left the gold standard relatively early, so we had a big monetary stimulus that other countries didn't have. But I think the numbers we're going to see in the second quarter are not going to be that dissimilar from what we saw in the Great Depression, possibly coming through faster than was the case back then. Yeah. And that raises a big question about what you do policy-wise to sort this out. Because standard macro policy in terms of fiscal and monetary stimulus is designed to do exactly the opposite of what health protocols are demanding. The health protocols demand that you shut things down. You don't want to have big positive multiplier effects coming through currently. What you need to do instead is to, I would say, try to bridge. And the bridge takes you from a pre-virus world to some unspecified post-virus world. And the idea of the bridge is that in the same way that ventilators keep individuals alive while they're trying to deal with the virus, The bridge is to keep businesses alive and employees possibly furloughed, but still, in theory, employed by those companies during a period of effective hibernation.
Do you think the Chancellor? Steve, do you think the Chancellor in the UK has got it right so far?
I think he's done a pretty good job, actually. I think under the circumstances, he got it quickly. I'd like to think that my Evening Standard article from about 6 weeks ago was the reason behind it. I somehow
read it.
He might have read it. You know, it had his name in it, so he probably did read it. But
he's got a very able father-in-law, as we know, in India.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think there have been difficulties with it because this is such a huge challenge in a relatively short space of time. You know, that there are groups going to be left behind as you try to do this. So the self-employed were one group that was very difficult to deal with, and then more recently, of course, charities have been another group that's difficult to deal with. Yeah. But I think the principle, broadly speaking, has been right, and the principle is that government should commit to building up very large amounts of public debt, if necessary, because it's the only way you're going to finance this bridge. And what you hope is that, well, basically you've got a sort of binary choice, I think, for a year or 2 years down the road. The binary choice is this: you either don't build the bridge, in which case we will have a second Great Depression, and there'll be mass unemployment for a long period of time. And so many companies will fail that it will take ages to rebuild things and get things back to normal. Or you build some form of bridge where the consequences will be much higher levels of government debt, but at least with these hibernating companies, you have a chance that some of them will come back to life. Yeah. But that gives you more of a sort of V-shaped sort of uplift at the end of the whole process. You've got hope of that. It's not guaranteed, but there's a hope. At least you're making the right kind of gamble, I would suggest. And then you have a bunch of things to deal with a little later on. So you've now got high levels of debt, so what do you do about it? And we know from the post-Great War experience that you could end up, if you're very unfortunate, with hyperinflation, which is what happened in Germany and Austria, partly because of reparations, of course. You could end up with austerity, which is what happened in the UK in the 1920s, partly because of the return to the gold standard of the pre-First World War I exchange rate. Or you could end up with default. Those things are possible. Or alternatively, you can work out, which is what happened after World War II, that if you bring yourselves together and have international institutions that set rules of the game and allow countries to be reasonably well integrated, then in those circumstances, you may get decent growth. And the point about decent growth is that debt is relevant only in respect of the level of income you're generating each year. So the debt-GDP ratio is what really matters, not debt itself. So if your GDP is rising quickly, if your denominator is rising quickly, then you can grow your way out of the debt problem. And that's broadly, it's not entirely, but broadly what happened in the 1950s. So the 1950s were a much more dynamic decade than the 1920s had been. So you might
could I bring Charles Bruce in? He has a great deal to do with India and with Asia. Yes. And I know he's got some questions he'd love to ask you. Charles.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, hi. You published When the Money Runs Out and
yes,
Grave New World, which to an extent it's a sort of rehearsal for what's about to happen.
Maybe.
So are you able to somehow bring the conclusions you reached from those books to bear on policy decisions which governments are going to have to start looking at very seriously? You just actually touched on it with the four alternatives. I'm really interested in this new international institutions. You came up with an extraordinary acronym. Was it GOF?
GOF, yeah, you read this very well. I must say,
we need to have a new GOF, don't we? It's a new Bretton Woods. And who's going to take the lead in this?
Yes, I think so. In an ideal world, yes, you would. So in my perfect world, where we learn the right lessons from this episode. We look at what the scientists are doing around the world, and we would say that there's lots of information sharing and papers being published before they've been peer reviewed, but it's better to get the papers out rather than hide them in some academic journal for a long period of time. And the more of this kind of integrated scientific analysis that we see, the better is the chance that perhaps a vaccine emerges more quickly, and that the world is saved. I mean, the world is saved from a pharmaceutical point of view, but the world is also saved from a sort of economic point of view too. So that would be great. And it's true that in the intervening period, there are things that could be done to support this process. So going back to the emerging markets, who I think hugely vulnerable in this current story, there are two things that could be done to help them financially. The first one is what they might do themselves, which is to reimpose capital controls, which is an act of desperation, really, because you're trying to stop capital from leaving your country at your moment of greatest difficulty, which of course is one reason why a lot of capital has already left these countries, because people recognize this is a danger. But the other possibility is that the West provides resources to these countries, some kind of emerging market Marshall Plan, but it might mean in the very early stages just printing lots of dollars, because there's a desperate shortage of dollars around the world, so you can do that. But longer term, particularly when there's some kind of rebound in Western economic activity, you might say now is the time to do something to really help these countries, to get them back on some kind of even keel from an economic and from a healthcare perspective. That would be great if all that happened. But I do think it's important to recognize there are some difficulties with all this. The first difficulty, most obviously, is that countries in the West are focusing on their own domestic difficulties. They might care about India or Brazil or whatever to a certain degree, but when you've got your own population in lockdown, it's your own population that comes first. So I think there's a limit to how much of this kind of help that can happen in the short run. The IMF is already short of funds for what it needs to do over the course of the next few months, and I suspect that Washington is not going to be enormously helpful, particularly under the current president. The second thing I think that's difficult is that, as indeed with what happened after the Second World War, I could see a situation emerging whereby China and the US kind of split in different directions. They both offer a version of global leadership, but you're kind of either on one side or the other. And the language between the two countries at the moment is pretty poor generally. I mean, even before the virus, it was poor, but now that you've got a blame game about how the virus spread and who's telling the truth, that level of trust is in danger of going into reverse. That's not great either.
No.
And the third issue was going to be my best point, but I've just forgotten what it was. It's going to come back shortly, I think, when my brain starts working again. Yeah, so you basically end up with these kinds of difficulties. Sorry, my third thing was this: that if you end up with some countries which have somehow got control of the virus, so the lockdowns have worked, that you're beginning to see improvements coming through,
like Taiwan, I guess.
Like Taiwan, possibly like China itself. So domestically, you can open up. You can take down the roadblocks. You can open up cinemas. You can open up restaurants and bars, and it might feel like you're back to normal, but actually you're not, because the lockdown that you've got rid of internally will still exist and possibly become stronger externally, because you're terrified of reinfection.
Yeah.
And so China today, for example, you want to go there. If I flew to Beijing today, I think I'm required to go into 2 weeks of quarantine before I'm allowed out on the streets of Beijing, which is another way of saying I'm not going. Right. And I think this is going to apply to a lot of countries. So take the UK as an example. I mean, let's imagine that the lockdown works, that maybe by June, July, if we're lucky, the curve has gone that way and everything's beginning to open up. Does that mean we're going to open up our borders to let people from, I don't know, Brazil or South Africa or India come to our country in the way that they used to? Or will we have significant curbs on that kind of travel? And migrant story, I think, has particularly big ramifications for certain parts of the world, notably India. Because if you think about the UAE and Saudi Arabia and parts of the Middle East, it's a sort of a magnet for
it's a remittance economy.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So people would have gone from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh to the Middle East. They won't go there. There'll be no remittances, and that means they're sort of cut off from the global community. The same is true of the Philippines, that Filipinos will struggle. I mean, those who are already living in another country, well, that's fine. But the migrant flow, I mean, I go to the Middle East quite a lot, and you just look at the departure and arrival balls in airports, and you realize the numbers of people that are coming in from India and Pakistan is extraordinary. So that stuff, I think, would tend to dry up. So anywhere where we relied upon the free movement of people across borders, that I think is in danger of going into reverse. Then in addition to that, I think in emerging markets in particular, this may be true of India, but it may be true of other countries as well. This sort of trade-off between lockdown and economic performance is one that I think is potentially quite worrying. It might lead to a loss of trust in the government of the day. That may lead to civil unrest. It may also mean that there'll be pockets within these countries where alternative governments will begin to emerge. And I'm thinking in particular of countries that may have problems with drug gangs and so on and so forth, where you could imagine that in certain circumstances it's actually the drug gangs that take over in certain places as opposed to the official government. So that gets pretty messy as well. But broadly speaking, free movement of people across borders is hugely limited if some countries have succeeded in controlling the virus and others have not. That in turn means that there are going to be some parts of the world that are going to be hugely disadvantaged compared to what we've been used to in recent times.
So the Schengen concept, that looks to me as that's going to not be very active in the future. I mean, Schengen is dead for the moment, right?
Yeah, so again, you come back to, I mean, I think it's a weakness in one sense of the EU, but Schengen was all based on the idea that everyone was equal and that everyone had equal rights across the whole of the EU, that people were free to move across borders because why not? You're an EU citizen, that's all that matters. But health protocols, which may vary from country to country, actually reveal that people aren't quite the same in current circumstances. A German within their own health protocol may have a different chance of carrying a virus compared with the equivalent Italian. So immediately you recreate borders because everyone has a national interest in looking after what's going on rather than the collective European interest. I mean, to be fair, it's happening within countries as well. Roadblocks obviously stop you from moving from place to place within countries as well.
Well, it's happening in the United States now, of course, but people going in and out of New York, that's seriously limited.
Yes.
And clearly there are different approaches to this by different states. So it creates this tension between the federal and the state authorities. And that may lead to unrest, of course, with Florida being slow to shut down.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and many of the flyover states that are Trump supporters, they've been very slow to react, presumably taking the lead from the president and from Fox News, that this is not a crisis, but they will gradually realize that it is.
I think also, to be fair, it took a while to spread to the flyover states. I remember talking to our US economist 3 or 4 weeks back, and he was at that stage foolishly optimistic about the outlook for the US, saying it only really got to the coastal areas and it was a problem all over. I said, well, it may not be a problem this week, but I guarantee you that next week it's going to be a big problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but I think the difference perhaps is this, that in the US, there are differences between the states, but most Americans feel American, if I can put it that way. Yeah. Whereas in Europe, it's not clear that people always feel European. They might feel European, but they might feel first and foremost German or Italian or French or whatever it might be. And there's no doubt that in Italy, there is a sense that they've already been sort of hit in the stomach, really, with the whole Eurozone sovereign crisis story and how that played out. And indeed, the performance of Italy economically relative to the performance of Germany, I mean, they've just diverged hugely over the last 20 years or so. If you then add to that the issue of differences in health protocols and the fact that Germany quite early on tried to control its medical supplies to stop them from going to Italy, because Germany recognized, to be fair, rightly, that it would need the medical supplies itself, that's led to an awful lot of mistrust emerging. And to be fair, there are ways around this. With my sort of economic hat on again, rather than thinking about the epidemiology of the whole thing, I think it is possible that European governments might eventually agree to sort of COVID-19 bonds, some kind of fiscal burden sharing. And actually, this makes a lot of sense because the virus does not respect borders. It's ridiculous to suggest it does. You ideally want to have a Eurozone fiscal compact to deal with this. And actually, it's doubly important given the need to have much higher levels of government debt. Now, in the UK, as of this morning, we have a Bank of England that's basically saying we'll buy the gilts if we have to. We'll start printing money to buy the gilts. That's much more difficult to do in the Eurozone context, unless you have common Eurozone bonds. So it may be that the Eurozone will recognize that fiscal and monetary policy really are joined at the hip. They're not independent in the way that people used to argue them as being. And perhaps the lessons from the US and the UK will be to actually make this work, we have to go in that direction. But I have to say, we're still a long way away from getting there. So, it could go either way, I think. But it is possible that Italy is a casualty of all this in terms of its own decision-making relative to the rest of Europe.
Stephen, thanks. I'm conscious, your great book, When the Money Runs Out, which you came and talked about in Scotland, and the other one, of course, as well. We may be in a situation where the time runs out on this call soon. I'm just going to ask Doug if he'd got any questions for you, our Institute Director. Doug?
Well, Stephen, thank you. I just find it fascinating that all of the issues that you're raising, it just reinforces to me the need for centralized solutions and global leadership. And that's something which I think in the current situation with America in particular, I don't know where that's going to come from. And I wonder whether...
I think this is where you come to the sort of US-China sort of clash in one sense, because the US doesn't really want to offer international leadership. I think over the last 10 years, been slowly pulling away from some of its previous international responsibilities for a whole host of different reasons. Particularly so under Trump. I think even before Trump, there was stuff beginning to happen. I mean, the famous story, I suppose, was with Obama and his red lines in Syria, which turned to be not red lines at all. I mean, there were a series of credibility issues that sort of cropped up. In the absence of the US being the leader, Europe, well, it's possible. I mean, you can imagine a situation whereby Italy, Spain, Germany, the curve is beginning to go down the opposite direction. People think, well, they've dealt with it, they understand what they needed to do, they've done it, they've made the sacrifice, they're now into the sort of home straight. And if Europe were to sort of internally come together more than it is currently, then it might offer some kind of leadership. China, I think China would like to. I mean, there's this whole business of sending doctors and nurses and so on to Italy, face masks everywhere. It's all part of a kind of attempt to soften up everyone else and saying, look, okay, we screwed up in the first place, but we're on top of it now, and we can help the rest of you to sort of cope with all this. But I think that a lot of people, it's clear in terms of UK domestic politics, there are a lot of people who are now very untrustworthy or not trusting of the Chinese. So that again will take a while to sort out. So to cut a long story short, my sense is that it's not clear at this stage where the leadership emerges from. I guess if Biden were to win in November, he would take the US a bit back towards a more globalized approach. But I think it's important to stress that he's partly hamstrung by Congress, and Congress is very, anti-China. Congress is not keen on, making these international commitments. And I sort of worry that each country will think after this crisis, we need to fend for ourselves. We can't trust the rest of the world. We'll look after our own people, and that's where it all starts.
Yeah, good, thanks. Stephen, thanks. Unless Charles has got something else he'd like to ask you, I suggest we draw this conversation to a close. Charles, anything to add or ask?
I just wanted to pick up on that point you made about India.
Yeah.
I'm running a charity that's feeding 115 families. So we're getting some extraordinary indication of what's happening. A large chunk of the population is not covered by rationing cards. And Modi's using that to discriminate against Muslim populations in the larger cities, where people are living very informally. So you're absolutely right. There's something very serious going on.
Yeah, I mean, this is a horrible thing to say. I mean, it's not horrible in the sense of being nasty to anyone. It's just the sense of reality that during the Spanish flu, I was looking at the numbers of deaths in different countries and different regions of the world. I'm not saying it's going to be repeated, but it's partly a reflection of differences in housing quality, sanitation, hygiene, all these kinds of things. So during the Spanish flu, 200,000 people died as a consequence of Spanish flu in the UK, according to the data, which may be unreliable. But 200,000 in the UK compares to about 17 million in India. I'm not saying these numbers are in any way representative of what's going to happen over the course of the next year, 18 months. But I do think that, again, the social distancing policies that you can do in some parts of the world, they just can't be achieved elsewhere. And in the absence of a vaccine, what you end up in those countries is pursuing what Boris was talking about all those weeks ago, which is basically herd immunity.
Yeah.
And that means that everyone's got to be infected. Well, not everyone, but I mean, 70, 75, 80% of the population have to be infected. And in the absence of, intensive care units and ventilators and so on, a lot of those people will die.
Yeah.
I mean, not everyone, because we know that the mortality rate is not that high. But if the mortality rate is, say, 1.5%, that's an enormous number of people for a country with a population of about 1 billion.
Yeah.
Good.
Sorry, made you feel very miserable now.
I think on that slightly gloomy note, but anyway, very informative discussion. I want to thank you very much for agreeing to do this. And
Pleasure.
just on the call, Lord Charles Bruce, who is a member of the board of the Asia-Scotland Institute, very much involved with India and other countries. Doug Cook, who is the Institute Director, me,
Yes.
Roddy Gow, and
Absolutely.
you, Stephen. And thank you very much indeed. Great
Thank
to
you.
talk to you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.